The Flaxborough Antiquarian and Local Curiosities Society prided itself on never producing anything more alarming than a misplaced catalogue card or the occasional collapse of a jam-tart tower during refreshment intervals. This reputation was one of its greatest comforts to the town, which preferred its excitement, when it could not be avoided, tidily scheduled and never too vigorous. Yet on this particular April afternoon, as a modest assortment of townsfolk assembled in the newly restored Cranmer House, something occurred that not even the most anxious committee member had penciled into the programme. Inspector Purbright, pressed into attendance by what Superintendent Chubb had described as a valuable show of local support, stood near a small table exhibiting Victorian household contraptions. He was engaged in the polite struggle of drinking society tea, lukewarm, aggressively tannic, and poured in a manner suggesting the pot wished to be anywhere else. Still, he persevered, smiling gently at the curator, Mr. Fondle, who fluttered about with nervous dedication. Cranmer House, a long-disused property recently acquired for heritage purposes, had been painstakingly arranged into a modest domestic museum. Each small room had been fitted with relics, hand irons, butter churns, an asthmatic grandfather clock that wheezed every 20 minutes, and, in the parlour, a Victorian speaking tube fixed to the wall. The device had been polished into implausible brightness by Fondle, who believed strongly that the public respected objects according to their shininess. At precisely 3:15, Miss Henbit was demonstrating the speaking tube to a cluster of visitors. Her voice, tremulous yet enthusiastic, filled the small chamber. One would simply speak into the mouthpiece, she explained, and the sound would travel through the tube to whichever room. A faint murmur interrupted her. It rose not from the visitors, who all stiffened, but from the tube itself. The parlour fell into stillness. The sound, soft and distinct, issued through the shiny brass opening as though someone stood at the opposite end, whispering directly into it. Not yet, the voice breathed. The words were quiet, far too deliberate to be mistaken for settling pipes or a draught. Several of the more sensitive attendees gasped. One man dropped his pamphlet. Mrs. Tallow uttered a good heavens, even though she had not quite caught what had been said. Purbright turned his head at once, but with the unhurried grace of a man who preferred to observe before reacting fully. Miss Henbit, stricken, attempted composure and failed spectacularly. The house. It spoke, she announced, as if providing an official statement. Mr. Fondle fluttered forward, wringing his hands. It must be a resonance, acoustic irregularity, air pressure, a very articulate air pressure, Purbright observed gently. Indeed, the whisper had carried an unmistakable human inflection, frustration softening into restraint, as though whoever spoke had intended more, but reconsidered at the last moment. The crowd, already predisposed to enjoy a mild panic, vibrated with excitement. Miss Henbit clutched Purbright's sleeve. "Inspector, you heard it, didn't you?" "I believe," he replied, "that I heard something." The parlour swelled with murmurs as the group debated the possible causes. Some ventured ghosts. Others, more pragmatic, blamed mischievous youths. Purbright remained quiet, allowing gossip to blossom at its usual speed. He noticed Fondle's pallor. The curator's eyes darted repeatedly toward the base of the tube, as if he feared it might speak again. Once the room's agitation had reached its peak, Purbright set his empty cup aside and ambled toward the wall. He bent slightly, examining the polished brass, running one finger along its rim. The tube's interior smelled faintly of metal and something older, dust, wood, and perhaps the faintest suggestion of oil. Nothing visibly obstructed it. It sounded close, Miss Henbit insisted, now trembling with legislative certainty, as though the whisperer were right behind the wall. Purbright glanced at the adjacent partition, a stout panel of 19th century timber. "If so," he said softly, "he must be quite cramped by now." Fondle attempted a laugh that resembled a cough caught halfway to escape. "Inspector, might I suggest checking the downstairs end? The kitchen was the other terminus, though we've blocked the tube there for repairs. No one could have reached it." "A blocked," Purbright repeated mildly. "Oh, cloth stuffing, temporarily, to prevent dust accumulation during the restoration." Conscientious precaution, Purbright said, though his tone indicated interest rather than approval. The parlour visitors, now emboldened by shared bewilderment, followed Purbright like a politely anxious parade as he examined the surrounding area. Near the skirting board, half hidden in a thin layer of undisturbed grey, he spotted something out of place. A small, hand-stitched glove, pale and fine, lying palm up as though placed rather than dropped. There was a monogram, delicately embroidered initials, faint from age. He did not pick it up immediately. Instead, he crouched, studying the dust around it. The footprint near the glove was partial, narrow, and recent. Someone had been in that exact spot not long before the demonstration began. Fondle, seeing Purbright's gaze, emitted another of his strained cough laughs. The volunteers sometimes wander, tidying, touching, children too, perhaps. Purbright raised a hand. In no need for speculation just yet, he lifted the glove delicately. It was too small for most of the attendants present, too elaborate for casual wear. Its monogram was finely done, the work of someone who either valued refinement or wished to be thought refined. Behind him, the parlour echoed with renewed whispers, but these belonged to the guests, who now theorized at breathtaking speed. Mrs. Tallow confidently told 3 people that the glove belonged to a murdered governess. Mr. Pym, the estate agent, insisted it was evidence of a devaluation sabotage. Miss Henbit had progressed to the belief that the house was trying to communicate. Purbright pocketed the glove with quiet care. The first sensation that crossed his mind was not alarm but curiosity, something about the timing, the precision, and especially the phrase not yet suggested intent rather than accident. He turned to Fondle. "For shall we look at the kitchen end of the tube?" Fondle nodded, though with the reluctance of a man who suspects the worst from his own handiwork. The group trailed after them down the narrow corridor. The kitchen was modest, containing cleaning supplies and a half-restored range. A cloth, indeed, stuffed the lower end of the speaking tube. It appeared undisturbed, and no one could have spoken through that, Fondle insisted. Purbright considered the cloth, perhaps not through it, but one might remove it briefly if one had reason. Fondle swallowed. A reason, Inspector. Purbright made no reply. A committee member, Mr. Hargreaves entered behind them, face flushed with indignation. "Inspector, what are we to tell the public? A supernatural utterance will frighten donors. I better not mention the supernatural parts." "Then," Purbright advised. Hargreaves deflated. With the whisper unresolved and the glove a quietly provocative puzzle, Purbright returned to the parlour. The crowd lingered, hoping for a pronouncement. He offered none. Instead, he gave a small, courteous nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "it may be wise to give the house a little air. Too much excitement may overwhelm it." This earned a ripple of uneasy laughter, which Purbright accepted with his mild smile. People began filing out, murmuring theories that grew increasingly baroque with every retelling. Miss Henbit paused by him. "Inspector, the house really did speak, didn't it?" He considered her earnest, fearful face. "It certainly made itself heard," he said. He watched the last of the attendees depart. The parlour, empty once more, felt faintly expectant, as though something had been interrupted and might resume at any moment. Purbright gazed at the polished tube, thoughtful. A whisper in a restored parlour was not in itself extraordinary, but its context, timing, and audience suggested design. As someone wanted a message delivered, someone else perhaps wanted it heard by the wrong ears. Purbright placed his hands behind his back, a familiar pose for quiet thinking. "Not yet," he repeated softly. He wondered to whom exactly the whisper had been addressed. By the following morning, Flaxborough had developed so robust and varied an account of the Cranmer House whisper that the original event, already fragile in its simplicity, had been entirely consumed by interpretation. What had begun as a soft, ambiguous murmur had evolved, through the town's unmatched capacity for embroidery, into a phenomenon of almost spiritual complexity. Mrs. Tallow was the first to circulate her version. She had heard, she claimed, a warning. Not merely a whisper, but a distinct prophecy of impending tragedy, delivered, rather helpfully, in her opinion, in the unmistakable accent of a metropolitan act. This flair for artistic specificity lent her retelling a certain authority among those who knew little of actors, but a great deal of Mrs. Tallow's appetite for dramatic certainty. By her second cup of morning tea, she had convinced the postman that the house had attempted to save them all from an unspecified doom, By her third, she had announced to the butcher's wife that the whisper foretold a sizable scandal, though she could not yet say whose. Across the high street in the estate office, Mr. Pym was ensuring a very different interpretation took root. The whisper, he explained to a client seeking a valuation, was clearly a staged event. He suspected, though he was far too professional to name names, a rival agency attempting to depress the desirability of properties in the newly revived heritage zone. Market manipulation, that's what it is, he declared, ignoring the fact that no one else had ever attempted to manipulate Flaxborough's market because its fluctuations were so small as to be merely theoretical. The client, who had only come in to inquire about sheds, left with the impression that Cranmer House was ground zero for a large-scale economic conspiracy. Meanwhile, Miss Henbert, whose nerves were tuned to a frequency accessible only to cats and clairvoyants, felt it her duty to inform others of the house's irresponse. She had visited the grocer's before breakfast and informed the astonished boy stacking potatoes that the building had expressed displeasure. She spoke of restlessness in old structures, as though describing the moods of a temperamental spouse. "It knows things," she whispered, leaning so close that the boy fled into the storeroom. Her conviction spread with alarming ease among those who had long suspected that buildings, like people, held grudges. By mid-morning, Purbright found himself the unwilling centre of these theories. He was strolling toward the police station, hoping for a quiet hour to review his notes, when Mrs. Quibble intercepted him with the determination of a guided missile. She had condensed 3 separate rumours into a single breathless narrative. The whisper was produced by a former tenant, tragically deceased, who wished to reclaim a hidden deed that Mr. Fondle had inadvertently uncovered during restoration. When pressed gently on any factual basis for this, she admitted that she had imagined parts of it but insisted the essence was true. Purbright listened with polite patience. Essences, he told her, have a tendency to evaporate when examined closely. She beamed as though he had complimented her insight. Inside the station, Sergeant Malley awaited him with the stiff posture of a man determined not to appear flustered. "Good morning, sir. I gather Cranmer House is haunted now." "So I'm told," Purbright replied, removing his coat, "though I suspect its ghostly career is being conducted second-hand by the town." Malley scratched his cheek, frowning. "You think someone used the tube deliberately?" "I think someone wanted something heard," Purbright said mildly. "Exactly what may require a little patience." Malley nodded, accustomed to these refreshments of ambiguity. "Should we bring in the boy Miggett? People are saying he's always up to tricks." People," Purbright said, "say many things. Boy, let us wait before adopting any particular favourite." When he stepped back outside, he saw evidence of a new rumour blooming. Mrs. Puckle, who often spoke as though her words cost her nothing, and were therefore used liberally, was telling 2 neighbours that the whisper had been a love confession. According to her, the house had repeated the words of a clandestine admirer hiding in the attic, which in her imagination was conveniently full of suggestive gloom. No one thought it odd that the whisper had contained no words remotely connubial. Purbright moved on, hands clasped behind him, observing the ripples of speculation. He found it less enlightening for content than for distribution. Which stories travelled fastest, which names people invoked, which details they embellished. Minor facts, he knew, seldom survived the town's digestion, yet their distortions often revealed more than anyone intended. At the tea shop, he paused to order a scone. Miss Henbit was inside, anxiously recounting her version to a captive pair of elderly sisters. When she caught sight of him, she hurried over. "Inspector, I do hope you're taking precautions." That whisper felt personal. "Did it?" Purbright asked gently. "Oh, yes, I could feel a presence. Something restrained, something waiting." Her certainty wavered only when Purbright smiled kindly. "The most troubling things in Flaxborough," he said, "are simply waiting for the right moment to be talked about." She blushed, unsure if she had been corrected or consoled. Purbright collected his scone and took a seat by the window, watching the ebb of townsfolk along the pavement. Their gestures, their exchanges, their quick glances signalled the same thing. They were searching not for the truth, but for a story that would gratify their appetites. Stories, after all, were easier to circulate than facts. Facts required labour. Stories only required breath. Just as he was finishing his scone, he noticed a detail more interesting than any rumour. Mr. Fondle himself hurried past the window, looking more strained than he had the previous afternoon. His brows were drawn tight, and he clutched a folded paper against his chest as if guarding something fragile. He did not pause to greet familiar faces. He moved as though hoping not to be noticed. Purbright's attention sharpened, though his expression remained pleasantly neutral. Fondle was no liar, but he possessed that delicate moral constitution common among earnest men, those who fear trouble so intensely that they inadvertently summon it. The inspector stepped outside. Fondle had already turned the corner, swallowed by the flow of gossiping townsfolk. Purbright made no attempt to follow. The day, he felt, was already providing him with more conversation than clarity. Better, at this stage, to let people speak freely. When truth hid, rumour often pointed, clumsily but usefully, toward its shadow. As the church bell tolled 11, he returned his hands to the familiar clasp behind his back. The glove in his pocket weighed almost nothing, yet in the light of the town's theatrical fervour, it felt increasingly significant. Someone had been where they should not have been. Someone had whispered not yet with reason, and already Flaxborough was doing what it did best, building its own elaborate explanations, leaving Purbright to sift the sense from the spectacle. By late afternoon, the town's rumours had grown so inflated that Purbright felt a return to Cranmer House offered a welcome, even necessary, dose of reality. The quiet of the place, compared with the speculative fervour outside, seemed almost medicinal. He approached the old house with the steady, unhurried step of a man who had learned that truth rarely required pursuit, merely patient observation. Mr. Fondle met him in the entrance hall, appearing as though he had been waiting anxiously, yet pretending not to. His hair, usually arranged with careful academic precision, was slightly disordered, and he clasped his hands with fretful compulsion. "Inspector, I didn't expect— well, that is, I wasn't sure you'd return so soon." "I find a second look clarifies the first," Purbright replied, removing his hat. People often reveal more in daylight than in commotion." Fondle attempted a smile that betrayed more strain than reassurance. "Of course. Do come in. The committee insisted the house be kept open today, though attendance has dwindled since the whisper. Indeed, the rooms were largely empty." A couple of visitors lingered in the main hall, whispering to each other with exaggerated caution, as if fearing the house might overhear. Purbright paid them no mind. His interest was fixed on the parlour, where the incident had occurred. Inside, the air was still, the objects undisturbed. The speaking tube gleamed with the same meticulous shine, though now its polished surface suggested not pride but nervous overcompensation. Fondle hovered near it as though afraid it might speak again. "I've been over everything," he said quickly, "and nothing unusual, nothing out of place." "Except the glove," Purbright said gently. Fondle's shoulders tightened. "Yes, that." Purbright allowed the silence to stretch until Fondle, unable to tolerate it, continued. "I can only assume it belonged to one of the volunteers. Perhaps it fell, though none of them mentioned it." "It was lying in dust," Purbright observed, crouching to study the baseboard again. "Untrodden dust except for one footprint. A small one." Fondle swallowed. Smaller than yours. "Unless you've taken recently to wearing size 4s. A flush climbed Fondle's neck. "Certainly not." Purbright straightened, letting the curator recover. Then he glanced down at the floorboards. The wood was old, uneven, with an imprecise restoration that suggested limited funds or limited expertise. One board near the fireplace sat fractionally higher than the others. "Has this room undergone much alteration?" Purbright asked. "Some. Cosmetic mostly. The floor is original, though we reinforced the joists in places. There was talk of replacing sections, but the committee disliked the cost." Purbright tapped the raised board gently with his shoe. Gently with his shoe. It gave a faint hollow note. Not unusual in an old house, but distinctive enough to draw his attention. He crouched again, pressing lightly with his fingertips. The board shifted, barely but perceptibly. Fondle stepped back. "Is it loose?" "I told the contractors that the parlour needed proper levelling. They insisted it was safe." "It's safe," Purbright reassured him. "Just unsettled." He applied a little more pressure. The board tilted, revealing a sliver of darkness beneath. Not large enough for a person, but certainly enough for something or someone to have reached through or hidden an object. Fondle whispered, "He wasn't aware of that space." Old houses often keep secrets, Purbright said, though usually quiet ones. He lifted the board slightly, just enough to peer beneath. The cavity was shallow, perhaps 2 inches deep, but something had disturbed the accumulated dust. A small trail, a sweep of displaced grey, led from the gap toward the wall where the speaking tube was fixed. Fondle leaned in beside him. Boop. What does that mean? Ide suggests movement. Recent movement. Purbright replaced the board with deliberate care. Someone has been beneath these floorboards recently enough to brush away dust. Fondle paled. But how? You saw the board. It was flush enough. No one in the public could have tampered with it. And why would anyone? Purbright rose. That is the more important question. He paced the room slowly, tracing the line between the floorboard gap and the wall. The speaking tube's base sat directly above a wooden panel with a narrow seam, barely visible, unless one were looking for it. You've restored the interior walls? Purbright asked. Only lightly. We repainted, tidied up plaster in the upstairs hallway, refitted the kitchen. But the parlour walls? No, those are mostly original. Purbright pressed against the panel. It resisted, then gave a tiny creak. A hinge, old and stiff, protested faintly. The panel opened just a fraction, no more than the width of a pencil. Fondle gasped. A concealed hatch. I never knew, and neither, I suspect, did most who have worked here recently, Purbright said. But someone discovered it. Through the sliver, he saw a narrow space behind the wall, an old servant's duct, perhaps once used to pass coal or carry sound between rooms. Now abandoned, forgotten, but not empty. The dust inside was disturbed, and a faint footprint, barely formed, marked the wood. Purbright closed the panel gently. Someone with access, someone who knew or guessed at old house structures, and someone small enough to move without leaving obvious traces. Fondle pressed a hand to his forehead. Trespasser? Not necessarily. Purbright glanced at the speaking tube. The whisperer would have had to be very near to the tube's base, very near indeed. The curator's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching dread. Inspector, are you saying that the whisper wasn't supernatural, nor accidental, but deliberate? Purbright offered him the faintest smile. If ghosts exist, Mr. Fondle, they rarely require floorboard access. A tremor passed through the house, subtle as a passing lorry, yet it seemed to ripple through the floor. Fondle startled. Purbright merely tilted his head. That, the inspector said, sounded like someone moving in the lower corridor. Fondle stared at him, wide-eyed. But the volunteers have gone home, and the house is closed for the afternoon. Purbright stepped toward the hallway. Then let us discover who finds Cranmer House so accommodating after hours. As they moved, the floorboards behind them gave a faint sigh, as though something or someone had only just withdrawn into silence. The corridor outside the parlour held only the dim, even silence of an old building settling into its own age. Yet Purbright paused a moment before proceeding, listening with the careful neutrality of one accustomed to distinguishing genuine disturbance from the house's natural size. Fondle hovered at his elbow, nerves jangling so visibly that even the wall sconces seemed steadier by comparison. They walked the length of the hallway, checked the side rooms, and examined the rear door, which remained locked from within. The faint sound they had heard could not be traced to any obvious source. Still, Purbright's gaze lingered on the scuffed tile near the back staircase, a narrow, sharp-edged mark deliberately wiped with a cloth or sleeve. Someone had been here, and not long ago. Is there anyone with a key besides yourself? Purbright asked. Fondle shook his head. Only the volunteers, and the committee officers, I suppose. But none of them would skulk about. They prefer visibility. It reassures them they're important. Purbright made a soft sound of amusement. Our visibility can be a burden. Fondle managed a wan smile, but it collapsed almost immediately into renewed worry. Do you think someone came here deliberately? To use the tube again? Perhaps. Or they returned to ensure nothing had been left behind. Fondle paled visibly. Purbright reassured him with a brief, steady glance before inspecting the rear staircase. Dust lay more thickly along the steps than in the front hall, but here and there a deserted footprint smudged the surface. Not the small footprint he had seen earlier. This one was larger, almost certainly belonging to someone who knew they had no permission to be back here. Before Purbright could comment further, a rapid patter of footsteps echoed from the entrance hall. Fondle flinched. The inspector turned. not with alarm, but with a mild inevitability of one expecting the next complication in a familiar pattern. Harold Miggett burst into view with the dramatic enthusiasm of a youth who believed doorways were stages and entrances should be made accordingly. His face was flushed, his hair so vigorously combed that it stood in defiant peaks. He skidded to a halt when he saw Purbright. "Oh," he said, deflating, "it's you." "He wasn't doing anything. I just came to collect my satchel. I left it behind yesterday. The committee woman, Mrs. Pelham, said you were poking around and that I might be wanted for questioning, but I didn't do anything, Inspector. Honest." This declaration was made with such urgency that even Fondle raised an eyebrow. Purbright regarded the boy calmly. "I see. And what time exactly did you leave your satchel here?" "Before the whisper," Miggett said. "I was helping arrange the costume stands." "Miss Henbit said I put the Tudor collar on backwards, but she always says things like that. Anyway, I forgot the satchel. I didn't realize until this morning." Purbright observed him for a moment, noting the slight quiver in the boy's hands. Not guilt. Fear. Miggett feared being blamed, not for anything he had done, but because the town's appetite for simple explanations often selected its scapegoats based on convenience rather than accuracy. "Did you hear the whisper?" Purbright asked. Miggett stiffened. "Everyone keeps asking me that." "I wasn't anywhere near the parlor. I was upstairs. It wasn't me. I didn't say it was." Miggett blinked, thrown off. "Well, yes, no. I didn't hear anything until people started screaming." Fondle corrected him gently. Nobody screamed, Harold. There was only a startled gasp. "Well," Miggett muttered, "it sounded like screaming." His agitation grew. Purbright watched him with measured quiet. "You seem very certain of your innocence." Because I didn't do anything. Even innocent people," Purbright said, seldom protest before they are accused." Miggett froze. The inspector's tone, mild as the day's weather, softened. "Tell me, Harold, why did you come now to collect your satchel? The house is closed." "I saw you go in," Miggett stammered. "I thought if you were here, you'd know if something was missing." "I didn't want anyone to think I was sneaking about." "You were," Fondle pointed out, blinking nervously. Miggett scowled. "Well, I didn't mean to. It's just rumors are going around that I made the whisper, that I crawled under the floorboards, or hid in a wall, or installed some sort of tube device. Everyone thinks I did it. People always think it's me." His voice cracked on the last word. Purbright noted it. "And why do they think that?" the inspector asked. "Because I did that lantern trick last summer," Miggett muttered, "and the council meeting incident with the puppet. Everyone blew it out of proportion." Fondle coughed discreetly. "The puppet did strike Councillor Plimms in the face, Harold. It wasn't aimed. Anyway, I've stopped doing that sort of thing. I'm trying to be responsible." Purbright folded his hands behind his back. "Then you will appreciate a responsible question. Have you been anywhere in this house you were not authorized to be?" No." Miggett looked deeply insulted. "I didn't use the tube, I didn't whisper anything, and I don't own any gloves, monogrammed or otherwise." Fondle looked sharply at Purbright. "You told him?" Purbright replied. Miggett realized his slip and flushed scarlet. "Mrs. Pelham said something about a glove. She said it was ladies' size, and that meant scandal. And she said you found footprints. And she said the whisper might have been a love confession or a threat or both." "I see," Purbright murmured, though. What he saw was the inevitable spread of committee gossip. Miggett swallowed. "If you think I did it, arrest me. But I swear I didn't whisper anything." Purbright considered him for several long seconds. The boy's sincerity, far from rehearsed, had the raw edges of someone who had rehearsed nothing at all. "I believe you," the inspector said finally. Miggett sagged as though a rope holding him upright had been cut. "You do, yes. And even if I didn't, your talent for theatrics lacks the subtlety this incident required." Fondle, relieved, nodded vigorously. Quite," Miggett bristled. "I can be subtle. I'm sure you can," Purbright said gently. But not yesterday." Miggett's indignation faltered into bewilderment. "Then who are people blaming?" People," Purbright said, "are not your responsibility." Miggett looked unconvinced, but Purbright dismissed him with a kindly nod. The boy retrieved his satchel, its contents rattling suspiciously, and hurried out, leaving Fondle and Purbright alone in the corridor once more. Fondle exhaled. "Well, that's one suspect ruled out. One comfortable suspect," Purbright corrected. Inconvenience breeds enthusiasm, especially where explanations are concerned. Fondle blinked. You think someone wants Harold blamed? I think, Purbright said, that the easiest answers tend to appeal most to those who fear the difficult ones. He glanced back toward the parlour. The whisper, the glove, the disturbed floorboards, no theory accounted neatly for all three. The town had already settled on Miggett because he fit the shape of mischief, but mischief had not whispered, not yet with such hushed precision. Purbright's expression, serene as always, gained the faintest crease of thought. Someone, he murmured, is directing attention, just not toward themselves. And with that, he resumed his quiet study of the room, the floor, and the shadows that were beginning, piece by piece, to reveal more than they concealed. When Miggett had gone and Fondle's nerves had retreated to their customary quiver rather than outright tremor, Purbright took one last measured look at the parlour. The raised board, the faint footprint, the whispered "not yet." Each detail leaned toward deliberation rather than accident. Yet none of them, he felt, had offered the direction he needed. Not yet. He left Cranmer House with his hands clasped behind him, strolling into the soft late afternoon quiet of the High Street. The town's chatter still hummed around him, snippets of speculation drifting from shop doors and pub windows, but he allowed them to wash past. He had no objection to gossip as long as it didn't interfere with listening. At the tea shop where he had earlier taken his scone, he paused again. Not for refreshment this time, but because the unmistakable voice of Miss Henbit drifted into the street. Her tone was pitched low, earnest and possessed of a certain dramatic gravity. Purbright stepped inside. Miss Henbit sat at a corner table with Mrs. Quibble, who was absorbing every word with conspiratorial rapture. A pot of tea sat between them like an oracle presiding over its disciples. I'm telling you, Miss Henbit insisted, he owed something he could never repay. And these things, well, they always returned to haunt one. The phrase, the debt he could never repay, made Purbright pause. He had heard variations of it in Flaxborough often enough, but seldom uttered with such certainty by a person who could hardly be trusted to recall her own umbrella. He stepped toward their table. "Ladies," he said, inclining his head politely. Miss Henbit jumped as if caught mid-treason. "Inspector, oh, you startled me. I apologize. I try to do so only when necessary." Purbright drew a chair. "I couldn't help overhearing mention of a debt." Miss Henbit stiffened. "Oh, meant nothing financial, merely emotional, moral. Certain people carry burdens." "Indeed they do," Purbright said. "Whom did you have in mind?" Miss Henbit's eyes darted to Mrs. Quibble, who suddenly discovered a deep fascination with stirring her tea. "Well," Miss Henbit said faintly, "Mr. Fondle, perhaps. He's always seemed a little pressed." "One senses these things," Purbright nodded. "One does. What gave you that impression yesterday?" she faltered. "Yesterday?" "Yes. You were in the parlour before the whisper. Did you observe something that suggested he was burdened?" Miss Henbit hesitated too long to construct anything convincing. "Well, I felt the atmosphere was heavy." "Atmospheres," Purbright said gently, "tend to be heavy when overfilled with committee members." Mrs. Quibble snorted, then hid the sound behind her teacup. Miss Henbit wilted slightly. "Perhaps I misinterpreted. I was very nervous. And quite understandably so." He left her with that, offering a small, polite bow. But as he stepped back into the street, his mind had already separated her nerves from her words. Miss Henbit was prone to exaggeration, superstition, and misremembering events that had not yet happened. But she was not malicious, which meant her remark likely originated somewhere else, something she had heard, or half heard, or been told not to repeat. Purbright walked toward the station, passing the tailor's shop, the bakery, and at last the small sewing shop tucked near the square. Mrs. Brindle, the seamstress, stood inside arranging mended garments with military precision. She noticed him at once. "Inspector, here for your cuffs." They were fraying again last week. "I live in hope that they will outlast me," Purbright replied with a smile. "But no, I'm inquiring about something that may have passed through your shop today." Mrs. Brindle brightened with the eager indignation of one who prided herself on absolute near-tyrannical order. "If someone left a garment unpaid for, I shall name them plainly. And nothing so dire," Purbright said. "I am looking for a drafting compass." She blinked. "A compass? In a sewing shop?" "In a sewing shop?" "The stranger things have happened." After a moment's thought, her expression sharpened. Yes, there was something. Someone returned a little metal instrument earlier. I thought it odd. A sewing customer wouldn't need such a thing. It had no tag, no note. They simply left it on the counter when I stepped into the back room. Did you see who? No, but it was placed very neatly, deliberately. Purbright nodded. The compass was indeed used during restoration work at Cranmer House. He had seen one among the tools. To return it anonymously implied not only guilt but a desire to erase the memory of borrowing it. May I see it?" he asked. Mrs. Brindle fetched the item from a drawer. Purbright examined the instrument carefully. Polished brass, a slight notch where it had been pressed too sharply into wood. "Recently used. Recently cleaned. Thank you," he said. "If the owner returns, do let me know." She watched him with keen curiosity. "Does this have to do with the whisper?" "I suspect," Purbright said, "that everything has to do with the whisper at the moment." He stepped back into the fading daylight. Between Miss Henbit's overheard remark and the discreet return of the compass, a shape was beginning to form. Not a full suspicion, but a faint outline. Someone connected to the restoration had reason to hide their movements. Someone with access to tools, knowledge of the building's old ducts, and perhaps a debt of the sort no ledger recorded. Back at the station, Purbright took a seat and placed both the glove and the compass on his desk. He aligned them carefully, not because order was necessary, but because order invited clarity. Two small objects, each displaced. Two people returning things quietly, hoping their absence would not be noted. Mally entered. "Anything new, sir?" "Only the smallest of details," Purbright said. "But small things have a way of pointing toward larger ones. What do you think it means?" Purbright looked thoughtfully at the glove. "That someone is trying to leave no trace." He paused, fingers lightly resting on the desk. "And failing," he said softly. By the next morning, Flaxborough's veneer of civility had begun to show fine cracks. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would name aloud. But Purbright sensed the subtle tightening of social threads, as though the town were a well-worn garment being pulled unexpectedly at the seams. Rumours about debts, hidden tools, and mysterious movements through Cranmer House had left several of its more respectable citizens strangely alert, as if someone had knocked politely at their facades and found them less solid than advertised. Purbright, arriving at the police station with the calm punctuality of a man immune to the town's oscillations, found Sergeant Mally frowning over a sheet of paper. The sergeant looked up with an expression that combined puzzlement, disapproval, and reluctant amusement. "Morning, sir. There's been a bit of intrusion." "Intrusion?" Purbright repeated mildly. Into the respectable Mally clarified with a sigh. 3 complaints, separate households, all connected with Cranmer House in one way or another." Purbright accepted the paper, scanning the names: the Bagthorpe sisters, Mr. Clavering the solicitor, and Mrs. Quibble, a constellation of the town's most scrupulously self-regarding residents. The Bagthorpe sisters reported a disturbance at dawn. Mally continued. "They say someone moved their garden tools and left the shed door ajar. Nothing taken." "Except peace of mind," Purbright murmured. Quite. Then Mr. Clavering claims someone slipped a note under his office door overnight. Says it was blank. He brought it in. Wants us to test it for invisible ink." Then Mrs. Quibble, Mally grimaced. She says someone tapped on her back window at 1:30. She looked out and saw a shadow. She described it as either a man or a shapeless darkness. "A useful distinction," Purbright said, handing back the report. Mally leaned forward. "But do you think these incidents are connected to the whisper?" "I think they are connected to the same nerves the whisper disturbed," Purbright replied. "Though whether they originate from fear, guilt, or imagination remains to be seen." He set off toward the Bagthorpe residence first, a pair of narrow, prim cottages conjoined like two elderly sisters leaning upon each other. Miss Agatha and Miss Prudence Bagthorpe greeted him at the door with identical expressions of affront, though Agatha carried hers with a more martial tilt. "Inspector," Agatha declared, "we have been violated." Only symbolically, Prudence added in a whisper, as though symbolism were almost worse. Purbright inclined his head. "Your tools were moved." Rearranged, Agatha corrected sharply, placed in deliberate disorder. The rake on the floor, the trowel on the shelf, the hose coiled in an inferior manner. "It was an insult," Prudence murmured, clutching her cardigan. Purbright examined the shed. Its contents showed no sign of forced entry. The disarray was subtle, almost artful, each object placed just enough out of place to provoke irritation rather than alarm. "Has anyone else access to your garden?" he asked. "Only Mrs. Quibble," Agatha said coolly. "And she enters only to criticize the chrysanthemums," Prudence added, "and Harold Migate sometimes peers through the gate. And Mr. Fondle once borrowed our string, though we retrieved it promptly," Agatha said. Purbright listened, noting but not interpreting. "Have you quarrelled with anyone recently?" The sisters exchanged looks suggesting the very idea was beneath them. "We do not quarrel," Agatha said. "We state truths." "And do others receive them gratefully?" Purbright asked gently. Prudence gave a faint, guilty cough. The inspector thanked them and left, satisfied more by their reactions than their information. A mild disruption to property, directed at the exact sort of people who would notice, and loudly. Someone was either sending warnings or performing diversions. Next, he visited Mr. Clavering, whose small office overlooked the square with the dignity of a retired barrister and the budget of a village clerk. Clavering himself stood behind his desk like a man prepared to cross-examine his own furniture. "Inspector," he greeted gravely, "gravely, I have received a threat." Purbright examined the blank sheet Clavering handed him. Smooth, perfectly ordinary, unmarked. And most threats, he observed, contain contempt. This one, Clavering declared, contains implication. Of what? "It was slid under my door after hours," Clavering whispered. "Someone wishes me to know they can reach my private chamber at will." "It is a public office," Purbright reminded him gently. Clavering huffed, and nevertheless Purbright returned the paper. "Have you recently handled any sensitive documents connected to Cranmer House?" Clavering hesitated. "Not sensitive, no. Merely the Restoration Fund accounts." Purbright's attention sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Accounts?" "Yes, there were some irregular receipts." "Nothing criminal, you understand. Merely creative arithmetic. And you mentioned this to anyone?" Clavering bristled. "I may have hinted to Mrs. Quibble that misallocations were possible. Strictly hypothetically. And Mrs. Quibble," Purbright repeated. "A reliable vacuum for hypotheticals." Clavering's complexion shifted to a faint shade of regret. Purbright thanked him with courteous finality and proceeded at last to Mrs. Quibble's neat little house, where the curtains twitched even before he knocked. She admitted him with a dramatic sigh. "Inspector, I have been visited," she intoned. "Last night, a dark presence tapped on my window." "Did you open the curtains?" Purbright asked. "No. What if it had seen me? What did you see of it? A shadow, possibly shaped like a person, or possibly elongated by moonlight, or possibly the neighbour's lilac bush swaying sinisterly." Purbright offered a sympathetic nod. "What suggests it was connected to Cranmer House?" "Well, Inspector," she said with the conviction of someone stitching thin threads into a tapestry, "I had been speaking yesterday with Mr. Clavering about those funds, and I may have whispered to Mrs. Pelham that someone was rummaging around the house at odd hours." And then, tap, 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 on my window. Purbright folded his hands behind his back. "Did you tell anyone else of the tapping?" "Only the Backthorpes, and Miss Henbit, and possibly the greengrocer, though only in outline." Purbright resisted a smile. "Quite. Good." As he left, he considered the pattern emerging from what seemed on the surface a handful of petty disturbances. Tools moved, a blank note, a tapping, each event carefully small but directed toward individuals who had recently spoken loosely, loudly, irresponsibly about matters touching Cranmer House. Someone was nudging the fragile architecture of town gossip, steering attention, sowing unease. At the station, Mally greeted him with a hopeful look. "Progress, sir?" "A little," Purbright said. "Enough to indicate someone is determined to remind certain people of their vulnerability." "Threats, warnings," Purbright corrected, but directed with surprising precision. Mally frowned. "Who'd bother intimidating those three?" "Anyone," Purbright said, "who feared what might slip from their respectable tongues." He sat at his desk, fingers resting lightly on the monogrammed glove. The more the town fidgeted, the more he sensed that the whisper at Cranmer House had not been meant for public ears at all, but for one person in particular. And whoever had spoken it was now tidying the edges of danger, nudging gossip away from themselves and toward the nearest and noisiest alternatives. Intrusions upon the respectable, Purbright knew, were rarely random. They were messages written in the language of small disruptions. and someone, somewhere, believed the message still needed delivering. By the time morning sunlight crept across Flaxborough's roofs with its usual shy politeness, Inspector Purbright had already formed the quiet expectation that something or someone would fail to appear where they were meant to be. The town had been nudged, unsettled, and prodded by small disturbances for nearly 2 days. Such things rarely occurred without a larger tremor waiting discreetly behind them. It was Sergeant Malley who brought confirmation, stepping into Purbright's office with the careful tread of a man who feared he carried news that might tilt the day unpleasantly. Sir," Malley began, "we've had a telephone call from Mrs. Fondle." Purbright set down his pen. "Is Mr. Fondle unwell?" "He's missing, sir." Purbright absorbed this with the stillness of a man who had suspected something close to it. "Missing," he repeated, not as disbelief but as the shape of an unfolding thought. Malley nodded, glancing uneasily at the glove on Purbright's desk. "He didn't return to his lodgings last night. His landlady says his bed hadn't been touched. His suitcase is still there. But he's gone. Did he leave any message? No, only his account book, left open on his desk. Mrs. Fondle said she didn't dare read it, but she noticed a smudge across one page. Looked like something had been rubbed out." Purbright's gaze sharpened. "Rubbed out recently? Very recently, sir." She thought it odd. He rose from his chair with deliberate calm. "Let us pay Mrs. Fondle a visit." Mrs. Fondle was not, strictly speaking, a spouse. She was the proprietress of the lodging house where the curator rented his small room. But she possessed the anxious, fussing authority of a woman who believed all men younger than herself, Fondle included, required constant supervision to avoid ruin. "Oh, Inspector," she moaned as she ushered them into a narrow hallway bursting with doilies. "I just know something dreadful has happened. He didn't come home, and he never stays out. And he didn't touch his supper. I saved his pie specially." Purbright followed her up the stairs, Malley behind him. She flung open the curator's door with theatrical misery. The room was tidy in the way of sincere, worried men, neat stacks of papers, an ordered desk, everything in place except for the absence of the man himself. Purbright scanned the space, allowing the smallest details to speak. The bed, untouched, coats and shoes absent, suitcase present and latched, desk open with the account book placed squarely at its center. He stepped closer to the desk. The blank page was indeed smudged, faintly but deliberately, as though someone had erased a line or figure in haste and then attempted to smooth away the evidence. Malley leaned over his shoulder. "It looks like someone wanted to remove something from the records." "Or someone," Purbright murmured, "wanted to remove themselves from responsibility for it." Mrs. Fondle wrung her hands. "He's been peculiar these last 2 days. Jumping at sounds, looking over his shoulder, muttering that he needed more time. More time for what I couldn't get him to say." That phrase, "more time," touched the same part of Purbright's mind as the whisper. "Not yet." He turned, scanning the corners of the room. Nothing overturned, nothing forced, nothing to suggest violence. But a sense of hurried departure clung to the air, a faint echo of crushed intention. Malley exhaled. "Do you think he ran off, sir?" "Running off requires a destination," Purbright said. "Mr. Fondle does not strike me as a man with many of those." They left the lodging house and walked toward the square. Purbright moved with a thoughtful slowness, hands again clasped behind him, the faint wind off the river carrying gossip like drifting pollen. Almost immediately Mrs. Quibble spotted them. "There you are, Inspector," she exclaimed, trotting toward them with the energy of a woman who hoped to deliver the first and best version of news. "They say Mr. Fondle has vanished, simply disappeared into thin air. Mrs. Tallow believes he's been swallowed by Cranmer House. I don't entirely dismiss the possibility." "I do," Purbright said gently. Then perhaps he fled," she insisted. "If people flee when they're guilty, you know, or frightened, or confronted with moral dilemmas, sometimes all three." "And what dilemma might you imagine for Mr. Fondle?" She stiffened in triumph. "Financial one." Malley choked. Purbright did not. "Might I ask," Purbright said mildly, "what led you to that conclusion?" "So why," Mr. Clavering hinted that the Restoration Fund accounts were questionable. He said numbers were being rearranged like a child's building blocks. I assumed the curator must be to blame. Purbright inclined his head in polite acknowledgement, though inwardly he traced the root of that loose hint, noticing how quickly it had been inflated into accusation. He thanked her and continued on. As they walked, Mally leaned close. "Sir, do you think Fondle's disappearance has anything to do with the whisper?" "I think," Purbright said, "it may have everything to do with it." They returned to Cranmer House. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, gilding the dust in drifting motes. Purbright moved through the rooms one by one, as though reacquainting himself with a reluctant witness. Nothing had changed visibly, yet the atmosphere felt altered, hollow where Fondle's fretful presence had once fluttered. At the parlour doorway, Purbright paused. He studied the speaking tube with the contemplative attention one might give a suspect who had said too little. Mally asked quietly, "Do you think the whisper was aimed at Fondle?" Purbright stepped inside. He reacted more strongly than most, and he returned here after hours. Someone warned him, or frightened him, or both. The inspector knelt once more beside the floorboard he had lifted earlier. Dust had shifted again, just slightly. Not enough for a stranger to notice, but more than enough for Purbright. "He came back," Purbright murmured, "after the demonstration, after the rumours, and before he vanished." Mally swallowed. "Why?" Perhaps," Purbright said, straightening, "to remove something, or to understand something, or to meet someone." The whisper seemed to linger in the air again, the memory of it rather than its sound. Not yet. Purbright looked at the speaking tube as though expecting it to confess. It remained silent, but he felt its importance deepen. "Whatever Mr. Fondle feared," he said softly, "it found him before we did." He turned toward the corridor. "And now," Purbright added, "we must find him before someone else decides his absence is convenient." By late afternoon, the search for Mr. Fondle had expanded into a polite but earnest sweep of Flaxborough's quieter corners. Polite because no one wished to alarm the town further. Earnest because even the mildest of men could, under strain, step inconveniently out of reach. Yet despite the constable's calm inquiries and Mally's earnest trudging from door to door, no one had seen the curator since the previous evening. Not at the station, not walking home, not slipping into any of his customary haunts. He had vanished with a thoroughness that felt uncharacteristic of him and entirely characteristic of fear. Purbright walked alone through the churchyard, where the late sunlight lay across the stones like a warm confession. He often found it a suitable place to allow thoughts to arrange themselves, never in lines, but in informal meandering clusters that revealed their shape only once he stopped trying to force one. The whisper in the parlour had been timed too precisely to be random. The glove too carefully placed to be dropped. The disturbances around the town too pointed to be coincidence. And now Fondle, nervous, guilt-prone Fondle, had vanished at the very moment when loose tongues and shifting numbers began pulling threads around. Human nature, Purbright reflected, was rarely dramatic in its errors. People seldom committed astonishing wickedness out of grand motives. More often, they were nudged by embarrassment, pushed by pride, tempted by the quiet hope that a tiny wrong might repair a larger discomfort. And when those small wrongs accumulated, they created a pressure so subtle that only those who understood the language of understatement could hear its warning. Fondle, for instance, was not dishonest. That much Purbright felt certain of. But he was a man who wished very much to be thought competent, and competence, when demanded rather than earned, could twist a person into precarious shapes. If the restoration accounts carried irregularities, Fondle would have suffered them like paper cuts. Tiny, bleeding irritations he hoped no one would examine too closely. And if someone whispered not yet into a tube designed to carry sound directly to his ear, he might have heard not a threat but a reminder of obligations he had long tried to forget. Purbright moved from the churchyard to the riverside path, hands clasped behind him. Children's laughter drifted from the park beyond the water, a faint, uncomplicated counterpoint to the town's undercurrent of tension. He remembered the disturbed dust beneath the parlour floorboard, the faint tracks in the hidden duct. Someone had crawled where others would not. Someone small in stature or flexible in purpose. Someone who knew their way around the house well enough to make use of its old passages, and who wished their movements unnoticed. But who among Flaxborough's residents possessed the necessary knowledge? The restoration crew, certainly. The committee members, perhaps. Clavering. No, too neat to get dust on his shoes. The Bankthorpes. Impossible. Neither sister could have knelt to investigate a flaw without issuing a municipal complaint. Miggit? A tempting suspect for those who trusted pattern over thought, but the boy lacked the subtlety for whispers. And then there was the person or persons responsible for returning the drafting compass to the sewing shop, an act both furtive and tidy, the act of someone more fearful than bold. Fear, Purbright mused, was often the truer guide. Not loud fear, which announced itself through panic and fuss, but quiet fear, the kind that seeped into people's decisions like moisture into wood. It made them erase figures in account books. It made them slip blank notes under office doors. It made them tap windows in the middle of the night not to terrorize but to urge silence. It made them move garden tools not to vandalize but to nudge the Bagthorpes away from their gardening gossip at precisely the wrong time. Someone feared being spoken of, and Fondle, soft-voiced and fluttering, had known exactly who that someone was. Purbright reached a small wooden bench overlooking the river. The water reflected the sky with deceptive calm, hiding its slow, persistent current beneath the surface, another of nature's gentle ironies. He sat, letting his mind wander just enough to settle into clarity. Fondle's disappearance was not the start of the mystery, it was the result of it. The first stirrings had begun long before the whisper, long before the glove. Something had soured in the restoration project. The diverted funds Clavering vaguely mentioned were more than arithmetic shortcomings, they were leverage. And leverage in small towns was often used by those who feared losing the place they had carved for themselves among their neighbours. The timid could be pressed as effectively as the guilty. Purbright recalled Miss Henbit in the tea shop, nervously repeating words that were not hers. A debt he could never repay. She had not invented that phrase. It had been said to her or near her. Possibly by Fondle himself, possibly by someone hinting at their own leverage over him. If Fondle had panicked, he might have fled not the town, but the confrontation he feared was coming. Yet there had been no reports of him at the station, the coach stop, or any of the surrounding lanes. Meaning he had not left, meaning he was somewhere close, somewhere quiet, somewhere he believed he would not be found. Purbright stood again, brushing a leaf from his sleeve. He had the sense, not certainty, but the soft alignment of intuition that Fondle had not intended to disappear entirely. Rather, he intended to buy that precious commodity promised in both whisper and muttering. Time, and time, like money, tended to run out. The inspector walked back toward the town with renewed purpose. The next steps would not involve searching hedgerows or riverbanks. They would involve people. Those who lied most subtly, those who lied without thinking, and those who lied so softly they convinced themselves it was truth. Respectability was often a mask worn not for admiration, but for protection, and someone respectable was growing increasingly desperate to keep it intact. Purbright decided, as he often did, that the most revealing circumstances were those in which people believed themselves unobserved, or at least unthreatened. He therefore arranged, with the gentlest manipulation of schedules and sensibilities, a small meeting of the Antiquarian Society's more talkative members under the innocent pretext of clarifying the visitor rota for Cranmer House. The phrase alone was sufficient to summon nearly every person who had recently fretted publicly about whispering tubes, missing curators, or disturbances in their garden sheds. The gathering was held in the modest committee room of the library, where the smell of paper and the faint perfume of polished wood gave the whole affair an air of mild respectability. Purbright had ensured that a plate of biscuits, shortbread, custard creams, and those slightly alarming pink wafers was placed conspicuously on the table. Tea had been brewed to a level of harmless mediocrity. He arrived precisely on time. Miss Henbit fluttered in moments later, followed by Mrs. Quibble, exuding the importance of someone who suspected she was attending a pivotal historical moment. Mr. Clavering entered with the brisk precision of a man who wished everyone to know he had other, more pressing places to be. Even one of the Bagthorpe sisters, Prudence, made an appearance, her expression suggesting she had come solely to prevent someone else from misrepresenting events. Purbright greeted them warmly. Thank you all for coming. I understand the last few days have prompted a degree of concern. I thought it best we speak informally. Clavering gave a curt nod. Quite right. Matters like these require clarity. Purbright smiled. Indeed they do. Please help yourselves to biscuits. This small invitation immediately softened the room. Even the sternest of Flaxborough citizens found it difficult to maintain indignation with a custard cream in hand. Teacups clinked. Chairs shuffled. Anxious expressions dissolved into socially appropriate calm. When everyone had settled, Purbright spoke again, his tone conversational. "We understand some of you have experienced disturbances. Tools rearranged, notes slipped under doors, tapping at windows." Mrs. Quibble straightened. "Quite so, Inspector. Sinister tapping. Very unsettling," Miss Henbit breathed. Prudence Bagthorpe sniffed. "One does not expect horticultural sabotage at dawn." "Quite," Purbright agreed kindly. "And yet, in my experience, such acts often arise from misunderstandings. People act out of worry rather than malice." Clavering took a biscuit with the air of a man taking evidence. "Misunderstandings can be dangerous, Inspector." "They can," Purbright said, "which is why context is important." He paused, letting the silence grow just long enough. "Take, for example, the drafting compass returned to Mrs. Brindle's shop. A curious object to find in a sewing establishment. Wouldn't you agree?" The room's collective posture shifted. Clavering's jaw tightened. Mrs. Quibble blinked twice, quickly. Miss Henbit looked alarmed for reasons entirely her own. Purbright continued lightly. "It was left there anonymously, but returned carefully, almost delicately, by someone who wished to erase a small oversight before it became a larger question." Clavering cleared his throat with legal authority. "If someone used a tool improperly, Inspector, they might simply wish to avoid embarrassment." "Embarrassment," Purbright said, "is a powerful motivator." He retrieved the monogrammed glove from his pocket and set it gently on the table. Miss Henbit clasped her hands to her mouth. Mrs. Quibble leaned forward, scandal expanding her eyes. "One glove," Purbright said mildly, "found beneath a loosened floorboard, quite out of place, but handled with care." Prudence Bagthorpe narrowed her eyes. "A lady's size?" "Yes," Mrs. Quibble gasped. "Then it must belong to—" "Belong," Purbright interrupted gently, "is a strong word, but it certainly indicates someone who had the freedom to move through Cranmer House quietly, someone who did not wish their presence noticed." Miss Henbit trembled. "Are you saying one of us crawled under the floor?" Yeah. Purbright smiled pleasantly. "Not necessarily, but someone went where others did not." He let the glove remain on the table, its presence more eloquent than accusation. Then he reached for a custard cream. "Human beings," he said, "often hide things not because they are wicked, but because they are frightened. A missing page from a ledger can come from fear. A whisper in a parlor can come from fear. A whisper in a parlor can come from fear. Even a disappearance subtly." Clavering's face had gone still. Prudence lowered her gaze to her folded hands. Miss Henbit's breath quivered audibly. Purbright poured himself more tea. The sound seemed disproportionately loud. "I wonder," he said softly, "whether any of you happened to speak with Mr. Fondle shortly before he vanished." A hush fell that felt almost physical. Clavering's voice, when it came, was tight. "We may have exchanged words. Nothing of importance." Mrs. Quibble leaned in. "He seemed jumpy yesterday morning. Very jumpy. He muttered something about time. But when I asked him what he meant, he turned quite pale." Purbright nodded, filing this away. "And you, Miss Henbit, did he say anything unusual to you?" Well, perhaps he mentioned being behind in his duties, or worried about the accounts, or something like that." I didn't pry. "You never do," Mrs. Quibble murmured with dubious sincerity. Purbright let the room settle again. "Thank you," he said. "It is helpful to know." He rose very slightly, not enough to signal the end, but enough to shift attention. "One last question, if I may." His voice was courteous, almost apologetic. "Has anyone here received a message, verbal or written, from someone wishing you to delay something, to wait, to stay silent?" Clavering's teacup rattled against its saucer. Prudence Bagthorpe drew in a sharp, guilty breath. Miss Henbit blinked rapidly, as though memories were rearranging themselves, and Mrs. Quibble, startled by her own recognition, whispered, "Inspector, the tap on my window, I thought it meant danger. But perhaps—" She trailed into confusion. Purbright did not respond. He merely nodded once slowly to himself. That was enough. Someone in this room had just betrayed a flicker too much. No more than the tightening of a jaw, a moment of rigid stillness, the near imperceptible recoil of a guilty thought. But Purbright had seen it. He had been waiting for it. "Thank you," he said finally. "That will be all for now." "I appreciate your candor." The meeting dissolved into polite unease and thin smiles. People drifted out in ones and twos, each carrying a biscuit they forgot to eat. Purbright remained seated, the glove still before him, his expression serene. The trap had worked. And one person, just one, had stepped neatly into it. The library meeting dispersed in a ripple of uneasy civility, each attendee leaving with the stiff posture of someone who feared that any movement might be interpreted as guilt. Purbright allowed the silence to settle again before he rose, took the monogrammed glove from the table, and slipped it into his pocket with the careful motion of a man placing the final piece of a puzzle he had been quietly assembling. He did not return to the station immediately. Instead, he strolled out into the cool evening, the lamps along the high street flickering into their customary amber glow. The town had entered that thin hour when daylight retreated, but gossip did not. Curtains twitched, silhouettes drifted behind windows, and every passer-by seemed to carry the faint tension of expectation. Purbright stopped outside Clavering's office. A single light glowed behind the frosted glass, its shape wavering as the solicitor moved within. The inspector let the moment stretch. He reflected briefly on the meeting, on Prudence Bagthorpe's startled breath, on Miss Henbit's flustered blinking, but most of all on Clavering's small, involuntary jolt when the word delay had been mentioned. A reaction too swift to disguise, too precise to misunderstand. Purbright knocked. There was a pause, then Clavering's voice, controlled but edged. "Yes, come in." Purbright entered with the unhurried composure that had unsettled many a flustered citizen before. Clavering stood behind his desk as though about to deliver an objection. His tie, usually knotted to mathematical precision, had slipped slightly askew. He did not fix it. "Inspector," he said, "a late hour for inquiries." "It is," Purbright agreed pleasantly, "but I hoped for a brief word, privately." Clavering gestured stiffly toward the chair opposite him. "If you must..." Purbright sat. He placed the glove on the desk between them. Clavering looked at it with the detached interest one might show a misplaced bookmark. "Do you recognize it?" Purbright asked. Ladies' accessories are outside my legal purview." Purbright smiled mildly. "A pity. It seems to have belonged to someone who visited Cranmer House after hours." Clavering's fingers twitched, not toward the glove, but inward, a tiny contraction of the hand. "I'm certain I don't know anything about that," he said. Purbright did not challenge him. Instead, he shifted the conversation with the same quiet grace that moved him through crime scenes. "You handle the accounts for the Restoration Fund, do you not?" Clavering stiffened. "In a limited capacity? You told Mrs. Quibble there were irregularities." "I may have remarked that the arithmetic lacked discipline." Purbright folded his hands loosely. "And did you mention this to Mr. Fondle?" Clavering hesitated. "We had a brief discussion, merely procedural." "A procedural," Purbright repeated softly. "You confronted him." Clavering flinched at the verb. "You wouldn't describe it as such." "But he would." Clavering inhaled sharply, the silence that followed revealing more than words might. Purbright let it settle like dust across the surface of the conversation. "You frightened him," Purbright said gently. Clavering's jaw tightened. "I expressed concern. That is different." "Not to a man like Mr. Fondle," Purbright said. "He is earnest, meticulous, and easily alarmed." "When you hinted that figures had been altered." "I never said altered." No," Purbright replied. "You said creative. Fondle would have heard criminal." Clavering's expression flickered guilt, passing over it like a cloud. "I didn't intend to upset him." "And yet he left his account book open," Purbright said. "A page erased in haste, a smear of graphite, a vanishing." Clavering swallowed. "He must have misunderstood me." "Indeed," Purbright said softly. And then came the whisper. Clavering's gaze snapped upward. Purbright continued, voice calm. "You knew of the speaking tube. You knew Fondle was fragile. You needed him to delay, not confess. So you whispered not yet, hoping fear would hold him still." Clavering's face drained of colour. "Inspector, Purbright held up one quieting hand. "You did not intend real harm. You intended hesitation. You needed time to correct the accounts before the committee examined them. You diverted funds, small amounts no doubt, but enough to require careful rearranging." Clavering closed his eyes briefly. "It was temporary. Only temporary. I meant to put it right." "And you would have," Purbright said, "if fear had not outweighed prudence." Clavering's voice cracked. Fondle panicked. He did," Purbright said. "Out thoroughly that he returned to Cranmer House after hours to remove whatever might incriminate him. Or you followed." You tapped at windows, moved tools, left a blank note to encourage silence, not alarm. Clavering sank into his chair. Oh, he didn't know how frightened he'd become. I never meant for him to run, nor for him to hide, Purbright added gently. But he did, and now he cannot return without believing the worst awaits him. Clavering covered his face with both hands. I thought if he just delayed, if he simply waited, I could fix everything. Purbright leaned back slightly. I fear Mr. Clavering is a poor accountant. It always adds more than one intends. There was a long pause. When Clavering finally looked up, his eyes held resignation, not defiance. "What happens now?" he whispered. Purbright's expression remained kind, though tinged with inevitability. "And now you will help us find Mr. Fondle. He is frightened, not dangerous. He believes himself ruined. We must ensure he does not remain lost." Clavering nodded slowly, like a man bowing to an unavoidable tide. "I know where he might be." Purbright met his gaze, steady and unhurried. "A thank you." Clavering exhaled shakily. "I swear, Inspector, my intention was never cruelty." "Workers are..." "Intentions," Purbright said, rising, "are often quieter than consequences." He picked up the glove, slid it into his pocket, and opened the office door. Clavering followed, subdued and oddly relieved, as though confession had lightened the weight he had spent weeks distributing in small, invisible gestures. Together they stepped into the dim corridor, where the evening shadows reached toward them like the soft closing of a chapter. Purbright's voice, when he spoke again, was gentle. "Let us go to him." It was close to midnight when Purbright and Clavering reached the narrow lane behind the disused bottling depot. The building stood half-collapsed, its corrugated roof sagging like a tired sigh. Clavering had spoken little during the walk, answering only when necessary, his earlier crispness replaced by a subdued obedience, as though confession had temporarily emptied him of structure. "He used to come here," Clavering murmured, pausing before the buckled side door. When the restoration work became stressful, he said the quiet helped him think. Purbright nodded. "Quiet can be useful. It makes room for the things we have avoided hearing." The inspector pushed the door gently. It opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, dust hung in the air like pale gauze. The moonlight, filtering through gaps in the roof, revealed a modest cluster of crates in the far corner, an improvised refuge. "A Fondle," Purbright called softly, as shape shifted. Slowly the curator emerged from behind a crate, his expression caught somewhere between guilt and hope. His collar was rumpled, his glasses askew, and his usually neat hair had surrendered entirely. For a moment he said nothing, as though words had become cumbersome. "Inspector," he managed, voice brittle, "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Purbright approached with the quiet patience of a doctor greeting a skittish patient. "You didn't cause trouble, Mr. Fondle. You stepped away from it, which is a very different thing." Fondle's gaze flicked nervously toward Clavering. The solicitor stood back, shoulders slumped, avoiding his eyes. "I suppose you know," Fondle whispered. "Yes," Purbright said, "enough to understand why you felt overwhelmed." Tears pricked at the curator's eyes. "Ooh, I didn't. It wasn't dishonesty, Inspector. I let some receipts fall behind. I misfiled a few invoices. I meant to sort it all before the audit, but then Mr. Clavering spoke about irregularities, and I thought, well, I thought it might look intentional." Clavering let out a low, miserable breath. "A Fondle! I never meant to frighten you." "You always frighten me," Fondle said with sudden, unexpected frankness. "You have that way of raising your eyebrow that makes me feel I've committed 2 crimes and misplaced a comma." Even Purbright allowed himself a faint smile. Fondle pressed his hands together. "I only crawled through the floorboards to check whether anything had fallen behind. I didn't want anyone to see me panic. I knew it would look suspicious." He swallowed. That's when I heard the whisper. "I thought it was, well, judgment." The whisper, Purbright said gently, was not judgment. It was Mr. Clavering, attempting persuasion. Fondle blinked. "Mr. Clavering," Clavering winced. "I hoped to urge you to delay the audit until I corrected my adjustments." Fondle turned a strange shade of astonishment. "Correct your... You told me I had been creative with the arithmetic." Clavering looked away. "I miscalculated several transfers. I intended to fix them before the committee noticed. I panicked." Fondle stared at Purbright aghast. He panicked. Purbright nodded sympathetically. A fear is not a respecter of professions. For a moment the 3 men stood in an odd triangle of shared embarrassment. It was Clavering who broke first. "I'm sorry, Fondle. I handled it poorly." I should say so," Fondle sputtered, whispering through antique plumbing. "Something." Tapping at Mrs. Quible's window, rearranging the Bagthorpe's tools. "Honestly, Clavering, you could have simply knocked on my door." "I feared you might speak to the committee before I corrected matters," Clavering admitted. Fondle pushed his glasses up his nose with trembling fingers. "I didn't even know how to speak to them. I only wanted everything tidy." Purbright placed a steady hand on the curator's arm. "It can be tidy again." And properly so. Fondle sagged as if that reassurance alone had taken half his weight with it. "You won't? Prosecute." Purbright considered the question. "There has been no theft, only errors, concealments, and ill-advised theatrics. The committee will require explanations, but explanations, fortunately, are inexpensive." Clavering exhaled in relief. Fondle's knees wobbled with gratitude. "However," Purbright continued, his tone remaining gentle but firm, "both of you will need to present the corrected accounts. Without creative arithmetic, without erased pages, without whispers." Clavering nodded solemnly, agreed. "And you," Purbright said, turning to Fondle, "will refrain from crawling into ductwork." Fondle flushed. "Yes, Inspector, good. Then let us leave this place. It has served its contemplative purpose well enough." They walked back toward town in a subdued procession, the cool night air easing the tension that had bound the last few days. At Fondle's lodging house, the curator paused, turning shyly to Purbright. "Thank you," he said, "for finding me before the rumour mongers did." "I find," Purbright replied, "that the truth travels more quietly than gossip. One must simply listen to the softer footsteps." Fondle smiled, wan but genuine, and disappeared inside, eager to retreat into proper walls and proper light. Proper light. Clavering lingered. "Inspector, will the committee be informed of everything relevant?" Purbright said. "But I suspect their main concern is that the restoration remain reputable." "You will assist them in that." Clavering accepted this with a grim nod. "I will." They parted, and Purbright strolled back toward the station. The high street was mostly empty now, save for a few lingering pub-goers who carried themselves with the solemnity of men discussing football as if it were diplomacy. Curtains glowed dimly behind drawn windows. The town, having exhausted its drama, was retreating into comfortable routine. At the station, Purbright hung his coat neatly, sat at his desk and opened the logbook. The faint scratching of his pen filled the quiet office. He wrote calmly, methodically, as though chronicling a mild administrative matter rather than a narrow avoidance of scandal. When he finished, he placed the glove in the evidence drawer, not as a criminal artifact, but as a reminder of how easily small things go misplaced when pride and fear are allowed to wander unattended. He leaned back, allowed himself a small sigh, and closed his eyes for a moment. Outside, the lamplight flickered. The town, restored to its familiar rhythm, settled into its night. Another whisper, another tremor, another human tangle had been smoothed back into place. And Inspector Purbright, content as ever to let the town forget its excitements, returned at last to quiet paperwork.